Why does your mind suddenly freeze the moment you try to speak English? You understand the question. You know the words. You even practiced the sentence before. But when it's time to answer, your brain goes completely blank. The sentence disappears. The words vanish. And you are left thinking, I know this, so why can't I say it? This happens to millions of English learners. It is not because you are not intelligent, and it is not because you don't know English. The real reason is simple. Your brain is still translating instead of thinking directly in English. In this training session, you will begin retraining your English brain step by step. You will practice how to stop translating, stop overthinking, and start responding instantly. By the end of this practice, your mind will begin forming sentences faster, clearer, and more naturally. Now, it's time to train. Would your brain so you can speak English confidently without your mind going blank. Chapter 1. The moment your mind suddenly goes blank. Many English learners experience a very frustrating moment when they try to speak. Everything feels clear inside their mind. They understand the question. They know the topic. They may even know the words they want to use. But the moment they open their mouth to speak, something strange happens. Their mind suddenly goes blank. The sentence disappears, the words feel lost, and they cannot respond the way they expected. This moment can feel confusing and discouraging. Many learners immediately think something is wrong with them. They believe they are not smart enough, or they believe their English ability is not good. However, this situation is actually very common, and it happens to millions of people who are learning a new language. The problem is not intelligence, and it is not a lack of knowledge. The real reason is how the brain processes language during a conversation. When you are studying English by yourself, everything feels easier. You can read slowly, listen carefully, and take time to understand what you see or hear. Your brain has enough time to think about the meaning and build a response. But real conversations are different. Conversations move quickly. Someone asks a question, and your brain must respond almost immediately. If your brain is not trained to respond in English quickly, it begins searching for help in your native language. The brain tries to translate. First, it understands the question in English. Then, it tries to convert the meaning into your native language. After that, your brain begins forming an answer in your native language. Finally, it tries to translate that answer back into English. This process happens very fast, but it still takes time. While the brain is doing all of this work, the conversation continues, and the pressure to respond grows stronger. This pressure can make the mind feel overloaded. When the brain is trying to translate, remember vocabulary, and build a sentence all at the same time, it becomes overwhelmed. Instead of producing a clear answer, the mind freezes. The sentence that you were trying to say suddenly disappears, and you feel like you cannot find the right words anymore. Another reason this happens is anxiety. When people feel nervous about speaking English, their brain enters a state of stress. Stress makes it harder for the brain to retrieve information from memory. Even if you know the words, your brain may struggle to access them quickly. This is why learners often say, I knew the answer, but I could not say it. It is important to understand that this blank moment does not mean you cannot learn to speak English fluently. It simply means your brain has not yet developed the habit of thinking and responding directly in English. Language fluency is not only about vocabulary and grammar. It is also about how quickly your brain can process and produce language during real conversations. Think of it like learning to drive a car. At the beginning, every action requires careful thought. You must think about the steering wheel, the pedals, the mirrors, and the road at the same time. This can feel overwhelming at first, but with practice, your brain begins to perform these actions automatically. The driving becomes natural because your brain has learned the process through repetition. Speaking English works in a similar way. When learners practice thinking directly in English and responding with simple sentences, the brain gradually becomes more comfortable. Over time, the need to translate becomes weaker, and the mind begins producing sentences more naturally. The moment when your mind goes blank is not a failure. It is a signal that your brain needs a different type of training. Instead of focusing only on memorizing words, you need to practice thinking, responding, and speaking in real time. This type of training helps the brain develop the speed and confidence needed for natural conversation. As you continue practicing these skills, you will notice that the blank moments become less frequent. While your brain will begin forming sentences more quickly, and your responses will feel more natural. Conversations that once felt stressful will start to feel comfortable. Understanding why your mind suddenly goes blank is the first step towards solving the problem. Once you recognize how the brain works during language learning, you can begin training it to respond more smoothly and confidently in English. Chapter 2. The hidden habit that blocks your English brain. Many English learners believe the biggest problem in speaking is vocabulary. They think if they memorize more words, speaking will automatically become easy. However, a different habit often creates the real obstacle. This habit is translating every thought from the native language into English before speaking. It happens quietly inside the mind. And many learners are not even aware they are doing it. Because this habit feels normal, it slowly becomes the biggest barrier to natural communication. When someone asks a question in English, the brain quickly understands the meaning. Instead of responding directly in English, the mind immediately moves back to the native language. The idea is formed there, and then the brain begins converting that idea into English word by word. This extra step may seem harmless, but it creates a delay. Conversations move quickly, and people expect responses within seconds. While the brain is busy translating, the moment to speak begins to slip away. This hidden habit forces the mind to perform several tasks at the same time. The brain must remember vocabulary, organize grammar, translate meaning, and construct a sentence all together. Each step consumes mental energy. When too many processes happen simultaneously, the brain feels overloaded. This overload is what causes hesitation, confusion, and those uncomfortable pauses during conversations. Translation also interrupts the natural rhythm of language. Human communication works best when thoughts and words move together. When translation becomes involved, that connection breaks. Instead of expressing ideas smoothly, the brain keeps switching between two different language systems. Every switch requires effort, and the effort slows everything down. Another problem appears when the translated sentence does not fit natural English patterns. Languages organize ideas differently. Word order, expressions, and sentence structures often vary from one language to another. When someone translates directly, the sentence may sound unnatural or confusing. The speaker may notice something feels wrong, and then the brain tries to correct the sentence while speaking. This creates even more hesitation. Because translation demands so much attention, it prevents the brain from developing automatic responses. Fluency depends on speed and familiarity. The brain must recognize common situations and quickly produce suitable phrases. Translation interrupts this process. Instead of learning how English naturally flows, the mind remains stuck converting ideas from one language to another. This habit also increases anxiety. During a conversation, the speaker may worry about choosing the correct words, fixing grammar, and translating accurately at the same time. That pressure builds quickly. The brain begins to focus more on avoiding mistakes than on expressing ideas. When that happens, confidence drops and speaking becomes stressful. Natural speakers rarely think about grammar rules or translations while talking. Their thoughts appear in the same language they are speaking. The brain processes meaning and words together. This allows sentences to form smoothly and quickly. Learners who rely on translation cannot reach this level of comfort because their thinking process is divided between two languages. Breaking this habit requires training the brain to connect ideas directly with English words. Instead of forming a thought in another language, the brain must begin creating the thought in English from the beginning. This does not require complicated vocabulary. And simple words and short sentences are enough to build this new thinking pattern. One helpful approach is describing everyday situations using easy English expressions. When the mind sees an object or an action, it can practice naming it directly in English. Small exercises like this slowly change how the brain processes language. Over time, the need to translate becomes weaker. Another effective method involves speaking simple thoughts out loud throughout the day. Describing actions, plans, or observations trains the brain to connect ideas with English expressions immediately. The more frequently this happens, the stronger the new habit becomes. With regular practice, the brain begins to recognize English as a natural thinking tool rather than a language that must be translated. Responses become faster, sentences feel easier to build, and conversations start to flow more smoothly. The hidden habit that once slowed everything down gradually loses its control. Understanding this habit is an important step toward improving fluency. When learners recognize how translation affects their thinking process, they can begin replacing it with direct English thinking. As this new skill develops, speaking becomes more comfortable, and the mind no longer feels blocked during conversations. Chapter 3. Why your brain understands but cannot respond. Many people learning English experience a confusing situation. They can understand what they hear or read, yet when it is time to respond, the words do not come out easily. A person may listen to a question and clearly understand its meaning. The brain recognizes the vocabulary and understands the message. However, when it is time to answer, more silence appears. The sentence does not form quickly, and the speaker struggles to respond. This situation makes many learners feel frustrated because they believe that understanding should automatically mean they can speak. In reality, understanding and speaking are two different skills inside the brain. Understanding English is mainly a process of recognition. When someone listens or reads, the brain only needs to identify words and connect them to meaning. This is similar to recognizing a familiar face in a crowd. The brain already knows the information, so it only needs to recognize it. Because of this, understanding often develops faster than speaking. Listening and reading allow the brain to absorb language gradually without pressure. Speaking, however, is a process of creation. Instead of recognizing words, the brain must produce them. It must organize ideas, choose vocabulary, build sentence structure, and send the message out through speech. All of this must happen within seconds during a conversation. This requires the brain to move quickly and confidently. Without enough practice in producing language, the brain hesitates because it is not used to building sentences so quickly. Another reason for this difference is the direction of language flow. When listening, language moves from the outside world into the brain. The speaker provides the words, and the listener simply interprets them. Speaking works in the opposite direction. The brain must generate language from internal thoughts and turn those thoughts into spoken words. This requires stronger connections between ideas and vocabulary. The brain also stores language in different ways. Passive knowledge is the language that a person can understand but rarely uses. Active knowledge is the language that the brain can easily produce during speech. Many learners build a large amount of passive knowledge by watching videos, reading articles, or listening to conversations. This knowledge helps them understand English very well. However, because they do not practice producing the language regularly, the words remain passive instead of becoming active. Confidence plays another important role in this process. When someone listens, there is little pressure. The listener does not need to respond immediately. Speaking creates a different situation because another person is waiting for an answer. That expectation can create tension inside the mind. The brain becomes cautious and begins searching carefully for the perfect sentence. During that search, the flow of speech slows down. Speed is another factor that separates understanding from speaking. A conversation moves quickly. Questions appear suddenly, and answers are expected right away. When the brain is not trained to form sentences rapidly, it struggles to keep up with the pace of the conversation. This delay creates the feeling that the mind has stopped working, even though the person actually knows the language. The difference between understanding and speaking can be compared to watching a sport and playing it. Watching a game allows someone to understand the rules and recognize the actions of the players. Playing the game requires movement, coordination, and practice. Language works in a similar way. Observing and listening build knowledge, while speaking develops the ability to perform. And the good news is that the brain can strengthen the speaking skill through regular practice. When learners begin forming simple sentences and speaking their thoughts frequently, the brain gradually builds stronger pathways for producing language. Words become easier to recall, and sentences begin to form more naturally. Simple speaking exercises help convert passive knowledge into active language. Describing daily actions, answering imaginary questions, and repeating common phrases train the brain to respond faster. These activities encourage the brain to connect ideas directly with English words instead of searching through translation. As the brain becomes more comfortable producing language, the gap between understanding and speaking begins to close. The learner no longer feels trapped between knowing and responding. Thoughts start turning into sentences more quickly, and conversations become less stressful. Understanding English shows that the brain already possesses the foundation of the language. The next step is strengthening the ability to express that knowledge. When the brain practices speaking regularly, it learns to transform recognition into communication. Over time, the moment when understanding turns into confident speech becomes natural and effortless. Chapter 4. The overthinking trap that freezes your words. A strange thing sometimes happens when someone tries to speak English. The person understands the topic, knows several words, and wants to answer clearly. However, the brain begins analyzing every part of the sentence before speaking. It checks grammar, searches for the perfect vocabulary, and then tries to make the sentence sound completely correct. During this process, the mind becomes busy with too many thoughts. Instead of helping communication, this extra thinking slows everything down, and the words stop flowing naturally. Language is designed to move quickly. In everyday conversation, people respond in seconds. A question is asked, and the answer appears almost immediately. When the brain begins examining every detail of a sentence, the natural rhythm of conversation breaks. Instead of speaking smoothly, the mind pauses while it evaluates each word and structure. Those pauses create hesitation, and the speaker begins to feel uncomfortable. Overthinking often comes from the desire to avoid mistakes. The brain wants the sentence to be perfect. It checks verb forms, word order, pronunciation, and vocabulary choice. While this careful thinking might seem helpful, it actually creates pressure. The mind becomes focused on correctness instead of communication. This shift in focus makes speaking feel like solving a complicated puzzle rather than expressing a simple idea. When the brain is overloaded with analysis, it struggles to retrieve words quickly. Vocabulary that is normally easy to remember suddenly feels distant. The mind searches through memory trying to find the best word, but the more it searches, the harder it becomes. This is why someone may know a word very well, yet fail to recall it during conversation. The pressure of overthinking blocks the natural connection between thoughts and language. Another effect of overthinking is self-monitoring. While speaking, the brain begins judging every sentence as it is being formed. It asks questions like, "Is this grammar correct?" Or "Is there a better word for this idea?" Instead of allowing the sentence to finish, the brain interrupts itself. This interruption breaks the flow of speech. Words are stopped halfway through, sentences change direction, and the speaker becomes unsure of what to say next. Natural communication works differently. In fluent conversation, the brain focuses on meaning rather than perfection. Ideas appear and words follow them quickly. The speaker trusts the language that is already stored in memory. Small mistakes may happen, but the conversation continues smoothly because the goal is sharing a message, not building flawless sentences. Overthinking often develops from years of studying language in a very careful way. Grammar rules, written exercises, words and correction of mistakes all train the brain to pay attention to accuracy. These skills are useful for learning structure, yet real conversation requires speed and flexibility. When the mind carries the same careful thinking into speaking situations, it becomes slower than the conversation around it. Confidence also plays a major role. When someone feels unsure about their English ability, the brain tries to control every word. It believes that checking each sentence will prevent errors. Unfortunately, this control creates tension. The more the mind tries to manage every detail, the less natural the speech becomes. The human brain works best when it trusts patterns it already knows. Through listening, reading, and practice, the mind gradually learns how English sentences sound and feel. And these patterns allow the brain to produce language automatically. Overthinking interrupts that automatic process. Instead of allowing patterns to guide speech, the brain begins rebuilding sentences piece by piece. Imagine trying to walk while thinking about every movement of your legs. The action would suddenly feel strange and difficult. Walking normally happens without conscious effort because the body has practiced it for years. Speaking a language also becomes easier when the brain relies on habit rather than constant analysis. Reducing overthinking requires a change in focus. The mind must shift attention from perfection to communication. Instead of searching for the most impressive sentence, it is more helpful to use simple words that clearly express the idea. And simple sentences allow the brain to respond quickly and keep the conversation moving. Practicing spontaneous speech can help the brain break the habit of overanalysis. Describing objects in a room, explaining daily actions, or answering imaginary questions encourages the mind to produce language without long pauses. These exercises train the brain to react quickly rather than carefully constructing every sentence. Another useful approach involves listening and repeating natural phrases. When the brain hears the rhythm of English regularly, it begins to store ready-made expressions. These expressions act like shortcuts during conversation. Instead of building sentences from the beginning each time, the mind can use familiar patterns that already exist in memory. The brain learns that communication does not require perfect grammar at every moment. The goal is sharing meaning clearly. As this understanding grows, the pressure to analyze every word begins to fade. Speech becomes more relaxed, and the mind allows sentences to flow more freely. The trap of overthinking can feel powerful, but it is not permanent. With consistent practice, the brain becomes comfortable producing language naturally. Words appear faster, sentences form more smoothly, and conversation begins to feel easier. When the mind focuses on expressing ideas instead of controlling every detail, the natural speaking ability that already exists inside the brain finally begins to appear. Chapter 5. Training your brain to respond. Without translating. Speaking English smoothly becomes much easier when the brain stops translating every idea from another language. Translation creates an extra step inside the mind. When someone hears a question in English, the brain understands it, then silently converts the meaning into the native language. After forming a response there, the brain attempts to convert the answer back into English. This internal process happens quickly, yet it still slows down communication. The conversation continues moving forward while the brain is busy switching between two languages. Because of this delay, words feel harder to find, and sentences take longer to form. Training the brain to respond without translating begins with building a direct connection between ideas and English words. Instead of thinking about a thought in one language and then converting it, the mind learns to attach the thought directly to English expressions. This connection becomes stronger with regular exposure and practice. When the brain repeatedly hears and uses English in meaningful situations, it gradually begins treating English as a natural thinking tool rather than a language that requires translation. Simple sentences play an important role in this process. Short expressions such as "I am hungry," "I need help," or I understand, allow the brain to produce language quickly without needing complex grammar. These small pieces of language become automatic responses stored in memory. When the brain hears a familiar situation, it can quickly select one of these patterns and speak it naturally. Over time, these patterns grow into longer sentences and more detailed communication. Daily observation exercises also strengthen this ability. When looking around the environment, the brain can practice naming objects and actions directly in English. A person might see a door, a table, or a window and quietly say the words in English. While walking outside, the mind can describe what is happening. The car is moving, people are talking, or the weather is warm. These small descriptions encourage the brain to attach English words directly to real experiences. Questions inside the mind can also help train direct thinking. The brain may ask simple questions such as, "What am I doing now?" or "Where am I going today?" Answering these questions in English encourages faster responses. This practice gradually builds a habit where thoughts begin appearing in English without the need for translation. Listening is another powerful tool for strengthening this connection. When the brain hears natural English repeatedly, it becomes familiar with the rhythm and structure of the language. Instead of analyzing grammar rules, the brain absorbs patterns. These patterns become internal templates for speaking. Later, when a similar idea appears, the brain can use the stored pattern to build a response quickly. Speaking out loud further reinforces the training process. Saying simple sentences aloud helps the brain connect thinking and speaking more directly. The voice becomes part of the learning process, and the brain learns how English sounds when it is spoken naturally. Repeating phrases regularly strengthens the pathway between ideas and words. Confidence grows as the brain becomes more comfortable producing English responses. Each successful sentence shows the mind that translation is not necessary for communication. Gradually, the brain stops searching for another language and begins trusting its ability to respond directly. Patience is important while building this new habit. The brain has spent many years thinking in one language, so creating a new thinking pathway requires time and repetition. However, consistent practice allows the brain to adapt surprisingly quickly. Each day of direct English thinking strengthens the connection between ideas and language. The brain begins to react to situations using English automatically. When someone asks a question, the response forms naturally without the extra step of translation. Thoughts appear in English and flow directly into speech. Conversations become smoother because the brain no longer feels overloaded with extra mental work. Training the brain to respond without translating is the foundation of fluent communication. Once this skill develops, the mind becomes faster, more flexible, and more confident. English stops feeling like a subject to study and begins to feel like a language the brain can use naturally. Chapter 6. Building Fast. English responses in your mind. Fast responses in English come from training the brain to connect ideas and language instantly. When someone asks a question during a conversation, the mind must understand the message and produce an answer within seconds. When the brain is not used to responding quickly in English, hesitation appears. The speaker may understand the question clearly, but still struggle to produce an answer because the mind is searching for the right words or trying to organize the sentence. The key to building faster responses is strengthening the pathway between thought and expression. Instead of spending time analyzing grammar or translating ideas, the brain learns to rely on simple sentence patterns that are easy to recall. These patterns act like ready-made tools that help the mind respond smoothly. When the brain recognizes a familiar situation, it can select one of these patterns and quickly adapt it to the moment. Short and simple answers are extremely useful for this training. Questions in daily conversations often follow predictable patterns. Someone may ask about your plans, your opinion, your feelings, or your activities. Preparing a few simple sentence structures for these situations allows the brain to respond faster. For example, responses such as, "I think it is interesting," "I will check it later," or "I am working on it now," provide a clear answer without requiring complex thinking. Another helpful method involves practicing mental questions and answers throughout the day. The mind can imagine common conversation situations and respond to them internally. Questions such as, "What are you doing today?" or "What do you think about this?" encourage the brain to produce quick responses. By repeating these exercises regularly, the mind becomes familiar with generating answers in English without long pauses. Speed also improves when the brain becomes comfortable with everyday vocabulary. Words used in daily life appear frequently in conversations. When the mind recognizes these words easily, it spends less time searching for them. This allows sentences to form more naturally. Repeating common words and phrases strengthens memory and helps the brain recall them instantly when needed. Listening plays an important role in building quick responses as well. Hearing natural English conversations exposes the brain to real speaking speed and rhythm. When the brain hears how native speakers respond to questions, it begins storing these responses as examples. Later, when a similar question appears, the brain can use those examples to build a reply more quickly. Confidence also affects response speed. When someone worries too much about making mistakes, the brain becomes cautious and slow. The mind begins checking every word before speaking, which delays the response. When the focus shifts toward communication rather than perfection, answers appear faster because the brain is no longer trying to control every detail. Practicing spoken responses strengthens the brain even more. Saying answers aloud helps the mind coordinate thinking and speaking together. This practice teaches the brain how to move from thought to speech smoothly. Over time, the voice becomes more comfortable expressing ideas without hesitation. Another powerful exercise involves describing simple situations quickly. The brain can observe daily activities and immediately form a short sentence about them. For example, while preparing food, the mind might say, "I am cooking dinner." Or while walking outside, it might say, "I am going to the store." These quick descriptions train the brain to create sentences rapidly without needing long preparation. Gradually, the brain develops what can be called speaking reflexes. Just as the body reacts automatically to certain movements, the mind begins reacting automatically to common conversation questions. When someone asks something familiar, the answer forms almost instantly because the brain has practiced the response many times before. Consistency is important for strengthening these reflexes. Each time the brain practices quick responses, the connection between ideas and English becomes stronger. The mind begins recognizing patterns and producing sentences with less effort. This reduces hesitation and makes conversations feel more natural. As the brain becomes faster at forming answers, so communication becomes smoother and more enjoyable. Instead of feeling pressure during conversations, the speaker begins to trust their ability to respond. Words appear more easily and sentences flow without long pauses. Building fast English responses is not about memorizing complicated grammar or perfect sentences. It is about teaching the brain to connect thoughts with simple language quickly. With regular practice, the mind learns that responding in English can be natural, immediate, and confident. Chapter 7. Turning simple thoughts into instant sentences. The ability to speak English smoothly depends on how easily the brain can transform thoughts into sentences. Every conversation begins with an idea. A person thinks about something they want to say, and the brain must quickly turn that idea into words. When this process feels slow or difficult, the speaker hesitates and the conversation becomes uncomfortable. Training the brain to convert simple thoughts directly into English sentences helps remove this hesitation and allows communication to flow more naturally. Thoughts appear constantly throughout the day. The mind reacts to actions, objects, feelings, and situations. Each reaction creates a small idea, such as noticing the weather, planning the next activity, or commenting on something nearby. These everyday thoughts provide an excellent opportunity to practice forming English sentences. When the brain becomes accustomed to expressing these ideas directly in English, speaking begins to feel easier. Simple thoughts are the best starting point because they do not require complex vocabulary or grammar. For example, The brain may notice that the room feels warm, that someone is walking past, or that the phone is ringing. These observations can easily become sentences such as, "The room is warm," "Someone is walking," or "My phone is ringing." These short sentences train the brain to express ideas quickly without searching for complicated structures. This process strengthens the connection between observation and language. When the mind sees or experiences something, it immediately links the experience with English words. Over time, this connection becomes automatic. Instead of thinking about the idea in another language and translating it, the brain begins creating the thought directly in English. Daily routines provide many opportunities for this type of practice. During ordinary activities, the brain can describe actions as they happen. Preparing food, walking outside, or organizing a desk all create moments where simple sentences can be formed. Saying or thinking phrases such as, "I am opening the door," "I am making coffee," or "I am writing a message," helps the brain build the habit of forming English sentences in real time. Questions can also encourage the mind to create instant responses. Asking internal questions like, "What am I doing now?" or "Where am I going?" prompts the brain to answer immediately. These quick answers teach the mind how to organize ideas into sentences without delay. The more frequently the brain practices this pattern, the easier it becomes to respond during real conversations. Another useful exercise involves describing objects or scenes. The brain can look around a room or a street and describe what it sees. So statements such as, "The window is open," "The street is busy," or "People are talking," encourage the brain to create clear sentences quickly. This activity strengthens vocabulary recall and builds confidence in forming ideas. Listening to natural English also supports this process. Hearing how sentences are structured allows the brain to absorb patterns. These patterns become mental templates that the mind can use while speaking. When a similar idea appears, the brain can adapt one of these patterns to express the thought more easily. Confidence grows when the brain realizes that communication does not require perfect or complicated sentences. Clear and simple expressions are enough to share an idea. Focusing on meaning rather than perfection helps the brain respond more freely. The speaker becomes less worried about grammar details and more comfortable expressing thoughts. With regular practice, the mind begins producing sentences almost automatically. Observations, plans, and reactions transform into English expressions without long pauses. This ability reduces hesitation during conversations and allows the speaker to participate more naturally. The goal of this training is to help the brain treat English as a natural thinking language. When thoughts and sentences are connected directly, communication becomes smoother and more enjoyable. Instead of struggling to build sentences, the mind begins expressing ideas with confidence and clarity. Turning simple thoughts into instant sentences is one of the most powerful ways to improve speaking ability. Each time the brain practices this skill, the pathway between ideas and English becomes stronger. Over time, the mind becomes faster, more flexible, and more comfortable expressing thoughts in English. Chapter 8. The Confidence Switch. Your brain needs confidence plays a powerful role in how the brain uses language. When someone feels confident while speaking English, their thoughts move more freely and sentences form with less effort. The brain becomes relaxed and focused on sharing ideas rather than worrying about mistakes. This relaxed state allows words to appear faster and responses to sound more natural. A lack of confidence creates the opposite effect. When the mind feels uncertain, the brain becomes cautious. It begins by checking every word before speaking. The speaker starts questioning whether the grammar is correct, whether the pronunciation sounds right, or whether a better word exists. These extra thoughts slow down the speaking process. The brain becomes overloaded with self-monitoring, and the flow of speech begins to break. Language is strongly connected to emotional states. The brain processes information differently when a person feels relaxed compared to when they feel nervous. When confidence is present, the brain uses memory more efficiently. Words that have been learned appear more easily because the mind is not blocked by fear or doubt. When confidence is low, the brain becomes distracted by worry, and this distraction makes it harder to access vocabulary quickly. Confidence also influences how the brain interprets mistakes. A confident speaker understands that small errors are part of communication and continues speaking without hesitation. The brain stays focused on expressing ideas rather than stopping to correct every detail. This allows conversations to continue smoothly. When confidence is missing, even a small mistake can cause the brain to panic. The speaker may pause, restart the sentence, or stop speaking entirely because the mind is afraid of sounding incorrect. Another important effect of confidence is speed. Fluent communication requires the brain to process ideas quickly. Confidence helps the mind respond without excessive analysis. Instead of searching for the perfect sentence, the brain produces a clear response that communicates the idea effectively. This ability to respond quickly makes conversations feel natural and comfortable. Confidence grows through experience. Each successful conversation teaches the brain that it can communicate effectively in English. These positive experiences gradually reduce fear and strengthen the belief that speaking English is possible. As this belief becomes stronger, the brain begins trusting its ability to form sentences without hesitation. Practice plays an important role in building this confidence. Repeating simple sentences, describing daily activities, and answering common questions help the brain become familiar with speaking situations. Familiarity reduces uncertainty. When the brain recognizes a situation it has practiced before, it reacts with greater ease and speed. Listening to natural conversations also helps strengthen confidence. When the brain hears how people communicate in real situations, it learns that language does not need to be perfect to be understood. Conversations often include pauses, corrections, and simple expressions. Understanding this reality helps the speaker feel less pressure to speak perfectly. Positive thinking can also influence the brain's language process. When someone believes they can improve their English, the brain becomes more open to learning and experimenting with new expressions. This mindset encourages curiosity and persistence. Instead of avoiding conversations, the speaker begins viewing them as opportunities to grow. Confidence can be compared to a switch inside the brain. When the switch is turned on, communication becomes smoother and ideas flow more easily. Words appear faster, sentences become clearer, and the speaker feels comfortable sharing thoughts. When the switch is turned off, the brain becomes tense and communication slows down. Activating this confidence switch does not require perfect grammar or a large vocabulary. It begins with trusting that simple language is enough to communicate effectively. Each time the brain speaks without fear, it strengthens the connection between confidence and language production. The brain learns that speaking English is not something to fear. Instead, it becomes a natural way to share ideas and connect with others. Confidence transforms the speaking experience from a stressful challenge into an enjoyable form of communication. Chapter 9. Breaking the fear of speaking. English. Fear can quietly become one of the strongest barriers to speaking English confidently. Even when someone understands the language and has practiced many words and sentences, fear can suddenly appear when it is time to speak. The mind becomes tense, the body feels uncomfortable, and the brain struggles to produce words clearly. This reaction often happens because the brain interprets speaking in another language as a situation where mistakes might lead to embarrassment or judgment. When the brain senses fear, it activates a protective response. This response is designed to help people avoid danger, but during communication, it creates unnecessary pressure. The brain becomes focused on avoiding mistakes instead of expressing ideas. Attention shifts away from the message and toward the possibility of being judged. Because of this shift, the mind begins to hesitate, and the speaker may struggle to find the right words. Fear also affects how the brain accesses memory. Words and phrases stored in the mind become harder to recall when the brain is under stress. The information is still there, but the mind cannot reach it quickly. This is why someone may know a word very well during practice, yet fail to remember it during a conversation. The pressure created by fear interrupts the brain's normal language process. Another effect of fear is overthinking. When someone worries about speaking incorrectly, the brain begins analyzing every sentence before it is spoken. It checks grammar, pronunciation, and vocabulary repeatedly. While this careful thinking might seem helpful, it actually slows down communication. Conversations move quickly, and when the brain spends too much time analyzing, the opportunity to respond disappears. Fear often develops from past experiences. A person may remember a moment when they felt embarrassed while speaking, or when someone corrected their mistake in a way that felt uncomfortable. The brain stores that memory and tries to protect the person from repeating the experience. As a result, the mind becomes cautious during future conversations. Instead of speaking freely, the brain hesitates and avoids taking risks with language. Overcoming this fear requires changing how the brain views communication. Language is not meant to be perfect. Its purpose is to share ideas and connect with others. People who speak fluently in any language often make small mistakes, yet communication continues because the message remains clear. Understanding this helps reduce the pressure to speak perfectly. Practice in comfortable situations helps the brain build confidence. Speaking aloud while practicing sentences, describing daily actions, or answering simple questions allows the mind to become familiar with producing English sounds and structures. Each successful attempt sends a positive signal to the brain, showing that communication is possible without negative consequences. Supportive environments also play an important role. Conversations with patient listeners create a space where the speaker can focus on expressing ideas rather than worrying about errors. This relaxed atmosphere allows the brain to practice speaking naturally and gradually reduces the emotional tension connected to language use. Another helpful approach involves accepting mistakes as part of learning. When a speaker views mistakes as opportunities to improve rather than signs of failure, fear begins to lose its power. The brain becomes more willing to experiment with language and try new expressions. This openness encourages growth and builds resilience during conversations. Visualization can also strengthen confidence. Imagining successful conversations helps the brain become familiar with positive outcomes. The mind begins to associate speaking English with progress rather than fear. Over time, this mental practice can reduce anxiety and encourage more natural responses during real interactions. With repeated practice and positive experiences, the brain gradually learns that speaking English is not a threat. The protective fear response becomes weaker, and the mind begins focusing on communication instead of avoiding mistakes. Words appear more easily, and the speaker becomes more comfortable sharing ideas. Breaking the fear of speaking English does not happen instantly, but each step forward strengthens confidence. The more the brain experiences successful communication, the more it trusts its ability to express thoughts clearly. As fear fades, fluency begins to develop naturally because the mind is finally free to focus on sharing meaning rather than protecting itself from imagined risks. Chapter 10. Training your brain with real daily situations. The human brain learns language best when it connects words with real experiences. Daily life is full of small moments that can become powerful training opportunities for English speaking. Every action, observation, and thought that appears throughout the day can help strengthen the brain's ability to form sentences naturally. Instead of waiting for a formal study session, everyday activities can become a continuous learning environment. Language grows stronger when it is connected to real situations. When the brain sees an action happening and immediately describes it in English, the connection between thought and language becomes faster. This type of training helps the brain respond naturally because the words are linked directly to real experiences rather than memorized examples. Simple activities provide many opportunities for practice. When preparing food, the brain can describe the process using short sentences. Thoughts such as, "I am making coffee," "I am cutting vegetables," or "the water is boiling," help the mind connect actions with English words. These short descriptions require very little effort, yet they train the brain to produce language quickly. Walking outside also creates valuable learning moments. Observing the environment encourages the brain to form new sentences. The mind might say, "The street is busy," "People are walking," or "The weather is warm today." These observations help build the habit of thinking directly in English, because the brain is responding to real surroundings. Everyday conversations can also become learning opportunities. Greeting someone, asking for help, or answering simple questions gives the brain practice in forming responses quickly. Even short interactions help strengthen the pathway between ideas and spoken language. Each conversation builds confidence and improves the brain's ability to react naturally. Technology can also support daily practice. When using a phone, reading messages, or watching videos, the brain can quietly repeat or summarize information in English. This activity encourages the mind to process language actively instead of only receiving it passively. The brain becomes more comfortable forming sentences because it regularly engages with English ideas. Planning daily tasks offers another useful exercise. While thinking about what needs to be done during the day, the brain can organize those plans using English sentences. Thoughts such as, "I will go to the store," "I need to finish my work," or "I will call my friend later," help the mind practice expressing intentions and future actions. Describing feelings and reactions also helps strengthen language skills. The brain experiences emotions during many moments of the day, and turning those emotions into simple sentences encourages the mind to express personal thoughts in English. Statements like, "I feel tired today," "I am excited about this project," or "This situation is interesting," help the brain connect emotions with language. Real situations provide an important advantage because they create meaningful context. When language is connected to real experiences, the brain remembers it more easily. Words learned during a meaningful moment are stored more strongly in memory because they are linked to real feelings, actions, and observations. Another benefit of daily practice is repetition. Everyday activities occur regularly, which allows the brain to practice the same types of sentences many times. Repeating these patterns helps the mind become familiar with common structures. So over time, the brain no longer needs to think carefully about each sentence because the pattern already feels natural. Consistency is more important than complexity. Short moments of practice repeated throughout the day can strengthen language ability more effectively than long study sessions that happen rarely. Each time the brain forms a simple sentence, it reinforces the connection between ideas and English expression. The brain begins responding automatically during daily situations. Observations turn into sentences without effort, and simple conversations feel easier. The mind becomes comfortable producing language because it has been practiced in real environments rather than only in textbooks. Training the brain with real daily situations transforms everyday life into a continuous language exercise. Each moment becomes an opportunity to think, describe, and respond in English. Over time, these small practices combine to create stronger speaking ability and greater confidence in communication. Chapter 11. How fluent speakers think differently. Fluent speakers approach language in a way that feels natural and relaxed. Their minds focus on sharing ideas rather than building perfect sentences. Communication becomes their priority, and this mindset allows words to appear more easily. Instead of worrying about every detail of grammar, they concentrate on meaning and expression. Because of this approach, their thoughts move smoothly from the brain into spoken language. The thinking process behind fluent speech is different from the thinking process used while studying language. During study sessions, the brain analyzes rules, memorizes vocabulary, and carefully examines sentence structure. This type of thinking is useful for learning, but it can slow down conversation if it continues during speaking. Fluent speakers rely less on analysis and more on instinctive language patterns that the brain has already learned through practice. Fluent speakers trust the language that exists in their memory. When a thought appears, They allow the words to follow naturally without searching for the most advanced expression. Simple sentences often appear first, and those sentences are enough to communicate the idea clearly. This trust allows their brain to react quickly during conversations. Another important difference is the way fluent speakers handle mistakes. They do not stop speaking every time an error appears. Instead, they continue communicating and adjust their sentences naturally as they talk. This flexible approach keeps the conversation flowing. The brain stays focused on sharing meaning rather than correcting every small detail. Fluent speakers also think directly in the language they are using. Their ideas appear in the same language they are speaking, which removes the need for translation. This direct thinking allows the brain to respond quickly because it is not switching between languages. Thoughts and words become connected in a single system. Exposure plays a major role in developing this mindset. Hearing natural conversations regularly allows the brain to absorb patterns of speech. These patterns gradually become familiar and comfortable. When the brain recognizes these patterns, it can use them automatically during conversations. Fluent speakers also pay attention to the rhythm of language. Natural speech has a flow that helps sentences connect smoothly. Listening to spoken English trains the brain to recognize this rhythm. Once the mind becomes familiar with it, producing sentences becomes easier because the brain understands how words usually move together. Another characteristic of fluent speakers is their willingness to keep speaking even when vocabulary feels limited. Instead of stopping the conversation, they use alternative words or simple explanations. This strategy allows communication to continue even when the exact word is not available. The brain learns to stay flexible and creative with language. Confidence strengthens this mindset as well. When the brain believes that communication is possible, it becomes more relaxed and open to expressing ideas. Confidence reduces hesitation and encourages the mind to speak freely. Each successful conversation reinforces this belief and strengthens the connection between thought and speech. Fluent speakers also practice thinking about everyday situations in the language they are learning. They describe actions, plan activities, and reflect on experiences using that language. These mental habits train the brain to associate daily life with English expressions. Over time, the mind becomes comfortable forming sentences without preparation. The brain gradually develops automatic responses through repetition. Common questions and topics appear frequently in conversations. When the brain has practiced answering these situations many times, it begins responding instantly. This automatic reaction makes conversations feel smooth and effortless. Another important part of the fluent mindset is curiosity. Fluent speakers enjoy exploring new expressions and listening to how others communicate. This curiosity keeps the brain engaged with the language. Learning becomes an ongoing process rather than a stressful task. The difference between struggling speakers and fluent speakers often lies in this mindset. One group focuses heavily on correctness and analysis, while the other focuses on expression and communication. When the brain shifts toward communication, speaking becomes more natural. Developing this way of thinking requires patience and consistent practice. Each time the brain expresses an idea in English without hesitation, the connection between thought and language becomes stronger. Gradually, the mind becomes more comfortable forming sentences quickly. For fluent speakers do not rely on perfect knowledge. They rely on familiarity, confidence, and the habit of expressing ideas clearly. Their brain has learned that communication is more important than perfection. This understanding allows language to flow smoothly and naturally during conversation. Chapter 12. Reprogramming your English thinking patterns. The human brain develops habits through repetition. Every thought pattern used frequently becomes stronger over time. When someone spends many years thinking in one language, the brain becomes extremely comfortable with that system. Each idea appears naturally in that language, and the mind automatically organizes words according to familiar structures. When learning English, the brain often continues using this same thinking pattern. Instead of forming ideas directly in English, that the mind first creates the idea in the native language and then attempts to convert it into English. This habit slows communication and makes speaking feel difficult. Reprogramming thinking patterns means teaching the brain to build ideas directly in English without relying on translation. This change does not happen instantly because the brain must replace a deeply established habit with a new one. However, the brain is capable of adapting through consistent practice and exposure. Each time a thought appears directly in English, the mind strengthens a new pathway for language processing. Direct English thinking begins with simple ideas. The brain does not need complex sentences to start forming this new habit. Basic observations, actions, and feelings provide excellent opportunities for practice. When the mind notices something in the environment, it can immediately describe the situation in English. Statements such as, "the door is open," "the room is quiet," or "I am walking outside" help the brain connect thoughts with English expressions. Daily activities provide continuous training for this process. When preparing food, organizing a desk, or traveling to a destination, the brain can describe each step using simple English sentences. This constant practice teaches the mind to associate real actions with English words instead of translating them. Over time, these connections become automatic. Questions can also help strengthen direct thinking. The brain can ask itself small questions about everyday situations and answer them immediately in English. For example, the thoughts such as, "What am I doing?" or "Where am I going next?" encourage the brain to respond without translation. Each quick response reinforces the new thinking pattern. Listening to natural English conversations also supports this reprogramming process. When the brain hears English regularly, it begins absorbing the rhythm, structure, and common expressions of the language. These patterns become familiar, and the brain starts recognizing how ideas are normally expressed. Once these patterns are stored in memory, the mind can use them automatically during speaking. Another effective method involves repeating useful phrases and expressions. Short sentences such as, "I understand," "I will try," or "that makes sense," become mental shortcuts for communication. These expressions allow the brain to respond quickly without needing to build a sentence from the beginning every time. As these phrases become familiar, the brain learns to react naturally in conversations. Visualization can also strengthen direct thinking. The brain can imagine simple situations and describe them in English. Visualizing a person walking through a park or preparing a meal allows the mind to practice forming sentences about those scenes. This exercise encourages the brain to connect images and actions directly with English words. Replacing translation habits requires patience because the brain must gradually shift from one thinking system to another. Each moment of direct English thinking helps weaken the old translation habit. With enough repetition, the brain begins to prefer the faster and simpler pathway of thinking directly in English. Confidence also plays an important role in this process. When the mind trusts its ability to express ideas using simple language, it becomes less dependent on translation. The speaker focuses on meaning rather than perfect grammar. This relaxed approach allows the brain to respond more quickly and naturally. As this new thinking pattern develops, conversations become easier. The brain no longer pauses to translate ideas before speaking. Thoughts appear in English and move directly into sentences. Communication becomes smoother because the mind is no longer switching between languages. Reprogramming English thinking patterns transforms the way the brain uses language. English stops feeling like something that must be carefully translated and begins to feel like a natural tool for expressing ideas. With regular practice, the mind gradually builds a new habit where thoughts and words appear together in English, allowing speech to flow with greater confidence and ease. Chapter 13. Building Automatic Speaking Reflexes. Fluent speaking often appears effortless because the brain develops automatic responses to common situations. These responses can be described as speaking reflexes. A reflex is a reaction that happens quickly without deep thinking. The human body uses reflexes constantly. When something unexpected touches your hand, the body reacts immediately. The same principle can apply to language. When the brain is trained properly, it can respond to questions and situations in English without needing long pauses or heavy thinking. During conversations, questions and comments often follow familiar patterns. People ask about plans, opinions, feelings, or activities. When the brain encounters these situations repeatedly, it begins to recognize them quickly. Recognition allows the mind to respond faster because the situation already feels familiar. Instead of building a sentence from the beginning every time, the brain learns to use patterns that have already been practiced. These patterns are created through repetition. Every time a person hears and responds to similar questions, the brain strengthens the connection between the situation and the response. For example, when someone hears the question, "How are you?" the brain quickly connects the question with possible answers such as, "I am doing well," or "I feel good today." The response appears quickly because the brain has practiced this exchange many times. Short phrases and simple sentence structures help build these speaking reflexes. Expressions like, "I think so," "That sounds good," or "I will check it later," become natural responses after enough repetition. The brain begins storing these phrases as ready-to-use communication tools. When a conversation requires a response, the mind can select one of these tools instantly. Listening to real conversations also strengthens reflex development. When the brain hears how people respond naturally, it absorbs the rhythm and structure of those replies. The brain begins predicting what type of response might follow a certain question. This prediction ability allows the mind to react more quickly during actual conversations. Speaking practice is another important part of building automatic responses. When sentences are spoken out loud repeatedly, the brain forms a stronger connection between thought and speech. The muscles used for pronunciation also become more comfortable with producing the sounds. This combination of mental and physical practice makes responses feel smoother and faster. Imaginary conversations can also help train these reflexes. The brain can imagine common situations such as greeting someone, answering a question at work, or discussing daily plans. By mentally practicing responses to these situations, the mind becomes familiar with forming answers quickly. This preparation helps the brain react confidently when similar situations appear in real life. Confidence also plays an important role in developing speaking reflexes. When the mind trusts its ability to communicate, it allows responses to appear naturally. Doubt and hesitation interrupt this process because the brain begins checking every detail before speaking. Reducing this hesitation allows the natural reflex of communication to appear. Another helpful approach involves focusing on meaning rather than perfection. The goal of communication is to share ideas clearly. When the brain concentrates on expressing meaning, responses form more quickly because the mind is not trying to build the most complex or perfect sentence. Simple expressions are often enough to communicate effectively. Daily life provides many opportunities to strengthen these reflexes. Describing actions, answering internal questions, and responding to common situations all help train the brain. Each moment of practice reinforces the connection between thought and language. The brain becomes more comfortable with speaking situations. Questions that once caused hesitation begin to feel familiar. The mind responds more quickly because it has practiced the patterns many times before. Words appear faster, sentences form naturally, and conversations move smoothly. Automatic speaking reflexes are not created through memorizing long lists of vocabulary alone. They develop through repeated use of simple language in meaningful situations. Each time the brain responds successfully, the reflex becomes stronger. With continued practice, the brain learns to trust its ability to respond instantly. Instead of pausing to analyze every detail, the mind reacts naturally. This transformation allows communication to feel easier and more confident, helping English speaking become a smooth and natural part of everyday life. Chapter 14. The Daily Brain Workout for Fluent English. Fluency grows when the brain practices using English regularly, Just like the body becomes stronger through physical exercise, language ability develops through repeated use of thinking, listening, and speaking skills. When the brain trains these abilities every day, the pathways that connect thoughts to English words become faster and more reliable. Over time, this training allows ideas to move smoothly from the mind into clear sentences. The brain functions like a muscle that becomes stronger when it is used consistently. Short but frequent practice sessions help build this strength. Even a few minutes of focused language activity throughout the day can create meaningful progress. Each exercise encourages the brain to connect ideas directly with English expressions rather than searching for translation. One effective workout begins with observation. Looking around the environment and describing what is visible helps the brain practice forming sentences naturally. Objects, people, and actions all provide opportunities for simple descriptions. Statements such as, "The window is open," "Someone is walking," or "The room is quiet" train the brain to convert observations into English thoughts quickly. Another powerful exercise involves describing daily routines. When preparing meals, traveling, or organizing tasks, the brain can quietly explain each step in English. Sentences such as, "I'm making breakfast," "I'm checking my schedule," or "I'm finishing my work," strengthen the connection between actions and language. Repeating this process regularly teaches the brain to think directly in English while performing everyday activities. Question and answer exercises also strengthen mental flexibility. Asking internal questions such as, "What am I doing today?" or "What should I do next?" encourages the brain to respond immediately in English. These quick responses simulate real conversations and train the mind to react without hesitation. Listening practice forms another important part of the brain workout. Hearing natural English conversations exposes the brain to rhythm, pronunciation, thus, and common expressions. The mind begins storing these patterns as examples of how ideas are normally expressed. When a similar situation appears later, the brain can adapt those patterns to form new sentences quickly. Repeating useful phrases strengthens memory as well. Short expressions such as, "That makes sense," "I will try," or "I agree with you," become natural responses when they are practiced regularly. These expressions act as building blocks for communication and allow the brain to respond smoothly during conversations. Reading simple material aloud also supports speaking ability. When the brain sees words and speaks them at the same time, it strengthens the connection between visual recognition and pronunciation. This activity helps the mind remember how sentences sound when spoken naturally. Visualization exercises provide another helpful workout. Imagining everyday situations, such as meeting someone, asking for directions, or describing a plan, encourages the brain to form sentences about those scenes. The mind practices responding as if the situation were real, which builds confidence and flexibility in speaking. Another useful activity involves summarizing information. After watching a video or reading a short article, the brain can explain the main idea in English using simple sentences. This practice strengthens the ability to organize thoughts and communicate them clearly. Consistency is the most important factor in this training process. Just as regular physical exercise builds strength over time, daily language practice gradually improves fluency. As each exercise strengthens the pathways that allow the brain to respond quickly and naturally. As these pathways become stronger, thinking in English begins to feel easier. Sentences appear faster because the brain has practiced forming them many times. Conversations become less stressful because the mind trusts its ability to communicate clearly. A daily brain workout does not require complicated study materials. Everyday life already provides many situations where language can be practiced. Observing, describing, questioning, listening, and responding are simple activities that help train the mind. With regular practice, the brain becomes more comfortable expressing ideas in English. The connection between thought and speech grows stronger, and communication begins to flow smoothly. Now, over time, this training transforms English from a subject to study into a natural tool for sharing ideas and experiences. Chapter 15. The moment your English finally starts flowing. There comes a moment in the language journey when speaking English begins to feel different. The mind no longer feels stuck or confused when a conversation begins. Instead of searching desperately for words, the brain starts responding more naturally. Thoughts appear more clearly, and sentences begin to form with less effort. This change does not happen suddenly like a switch turning on, but it becomes noticeable when the brain finally becomes comfortable using English as a tool for communication. During earlier stages of learning, the mind often feels slow when speaking. Words may exist in memory, yet they take time to appear during conversations. The brain searches through vocabulary, analyzes sentence structure, and worries about mistakes. This process creates pauses and hesitation. Communication becomes stressful because the speaker feels pressure to respond quickly while the brain is still working hard to organize the sentence. When the brain becomes more familiar with English thinking patterns, something begins to shift. The mind no longer needs to translate ideas from another language before speaking. Thoughts start appearing directly in English, which removes the extra step that once slowed communication. Because the brain no longer switches between languages, responses become faster and smoother. This improvement happens because repeated practice strengthens the connection between ideas and language. Every time the brain forms a sentence in English, it builds a stronger pathway in memory. Over time, these pathways become easier to access. Words that once required effort begin to appear automatically when the mind needs them. Confidence also grows during this stage. The speaker starts trusting their ability to communicate without needing perfect grammar or advanced vocabulary. The brain focuses more on expressing ideas clearly rather than worrying about small errors. This relaxed mindset helps the mind respond more freely, allowing sentences to flow naturally. Conversations begin to feel more comfortable as well. Instead of feeling nervous when someone asks a question, the brain responds calmly and begins forming an answer. Even if the sentence is simple, the message is clear. This ability to respond without hesitation creates a positive experience that encourages further practice. Another noticeable change involves speed. When the brain becomes accustomed to thinking directly in English, it processes information more quickly. Questions are understood immediately and answers begin forming almost at the same time. The mind reacts naturally because it has practiced similar situations many times before. Vocabulary also becomes easier to recall. Words that once felt distant or difficult to remember now appear more quickly because the brain has used them repeatedly in real situations. These words become part of the speaker's active language system rather than remaining as passive knowledge. Fluency during this stage does not mean speaking perfectly. Instead, it means the brain can communicate ideas smoothly without feeling blocked. Small pauses may still appear, but they no longer stop the conversation. The speaker continues expressing thoughts while adjusting sentences naturally. Another important change is the way the brain organizes ideas. Instead of building long and complicated sentences, the mind often chooses simple and clear expressions. These sentences communicate meaning effectively without requiring excessive thinking. This approach helps maintain the natural rhythm of conversation. Listening ability also improves during this stage. Because the brain processes English more comfortably, it understands spoken language faster. This improved understanding allows the speaker to respond more confidently during discussions. Daily experiences continue strengthening this ability. Every conversation, observation, or spoken sentence reinforces the connection between thinking and speaking. The brain gradually becomes more comfortable using English in different situations. The speaker realizes that communication no longer feels like a difficult task. English becomes a natural part of expressing ideas, asking questions, and sharing experiences. Conversations feel smoother, and the mind no longer freezes when it is time to speak. This moment represents the result of consistent practice and patience. The brain has learned to trust its ability to communicate. Thoughts appear in English, sentences form quickly, and words move naturally from the mind into speech. What once felt challenging now feels comfortable, and the speaker can finally experience the flow of real communication in English. Great work for reaching the end of this training session. If your mind has ever gone blank while trying to speak English, remember that the problem was never your intelligence and it was never your ability to learn. The real challenge was simply how your brain was trained to process language. When the mind tries to translate every idea, speaking becomes slow and stressful. When the brain learns to think directly in English, communication becomes natural and smooth. Throughout this lesson, you trained your mind to respond faster, build sentences more naturally, and trust simple English thoughts. These small changes help your brain develop a new habit where ideas move directly from your mind into words. The more you practice this way of thinking, the easier speaking will become. Fluency does not appear from memorizing thousands of words alone. It grows when the brain becomes comfortable using English in real moments. Every time you describe your surroundings, or answer a question, or speak a simple sentence, you strengthen the connection between thought and language. Keep practicing daily situations, continue forming simple sentences, and allow your mind to think in English as often as possible. With consistent training, your brain will respond faster, your confidence will grow, and conversations will begin to feel natural. Your English will not freeze anymore because your brain is learning how to speak automatically. Continue practicing, continue training your mind, and your fluency will keep growing every single day. Subscribe to the Fluency Doctor and keep strengthening your English brain with the next training session.